when people come forward, what we have to do, right, is listen without judgment and understand that when a person is expressing these kinds of struggles, the church's job is to receive them and point them in the direction of the professionals they need.
Hey everyone, what is up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Austin, and this is Gospel Simplicity, a place where we seek to bring simplicity out of theological and historical complexity. Today we're talking about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. As I sit here recording this, we are in the month of May, and hopefully it will be released in the month of May, which, as you may know, is Mental Health Awareness Month. Now, study after study continues to show us that an increasing number of people from all walks of life, whether religious or not, Christian or not, so many people are suffering from mental health. And I think it's something that we all need to be talking about. And I think it's something the church has done a particularly poor job of addressing. And so from the beginning of my channel, I've hoped to do my part in shedding light on this topic to release the stigmas around this and to allow people to say, hey, this is something I struggle with and be able to talk about this openly so that people can get the help that they need. And so today I'm talking with Ryan Casey Walker. He's a licensed psychotherapist. He's also a lawyer and Episcopal priest. He's a fascinating guy, and we have a really great conversation about depression, anxiety, mental health in general. We talk about suicide, and so I want to let you know that this is a very heavy conversation, and I'll be leaving resources in the description, including a suicide hotline. And please, if you are struggling with suicidal thoughts or ideation, I encourage you so much to use those resources and to get the help that you need. I think that's an incredibly brave thing to do. And so if watching this video is difficult for you for any number of reasons, I completely understand that. And if it's not a good season for you to listen to this, I understand, respect, and honor that. But I do think it is something that's so important for us to be talking about. And whether you identify with these struggles or people you love identify, or you just want to help usher the church into a place of having more helpful conversations or conversations at all on these topics, I think this video is for you. And this video is made possible by my sponsor, Faithful Counseling. Faithful Counseling is a Christian counseling organization that exists to help people get the help they need, and they do it from a faith-based perspective. They are an absolutely wonderful company to partner with. I so believe in what they're doing, and that's why I'm so excited to be telling you about them. If you reach out to them, you can go to faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity, and they will set you up with a licensed counselor in 48 hours. Now, if you've ever tried to go to a counselor through traditional means, you know that it can take months to get an appointment. And that is something that's so amazing to me about Faithful Counseling, because when we need help for these things, we want that help as soon as we can get it, because we're in pain and we want to do something about that. And Faithful Counseling could be your next step to getting the help that you need. Now, they're not a crisis line, and as I said, I'll leave crisis lines in the description down below. So if you are in a mental health crisis, I encourage you to use those. Faithful Counseling is an absolutely wonderful service. I encourage you to check it out. Go to faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity. Thanks again to them for all the work they're doing, not only in sponsoring this channel, but in helping people experience the life that they were created to live, a life free from some of this pain, or at least on the journey towards healing. So with that being said, I hope you all enjoy this video. Well, today I am joined by Ryan Casey Waller. Ryan Casey Waller is a licensed psychotherapist and pastor who has heard all of the jokes about being both lawyer and priest. But if you have another one, he's always game for more laughs. He studied philosophy and religion at the University of Southern California before pursuing a law degree, a master's in theology, and a master's in counseling from Southern Methodist University. He practiced law before turning to a career in ministry, serving in both academic and ecclesial settings. He is now in private practice in Dallas. He is also the author of the book, Depression, Anxiety, and Other Things We Don't Want to Talk About, which we will, in fact, be talking about today. So, Ryan, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it is my pleasure. And this is something that I'm very excited to talk about. I often mention to my viewers that from before I had a platform, if you will. One of the first videos I made was, you can have Jesus and a therapist too. And I never realized that later on I'd have a platform where I could actually be talking about these things that might be helpful for people. So as we're in Mental Health Awareness Month, and just in general, as it's such a needed conversation, super excited to have you on the channel today to talk about these things we don't often talk about. And I want to start with, which is also where you start in your book, just a bit of your mental health journey and what led you to writing this book.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for being willing to talk about it, and just to be able to say things like it's okay, right, to have Jesus and a therapist. That in and of itself is actually profound and significant and wonderful progress for those within the Christian community. So thank you. For myself, I'm a person who I very much identify as a co-sufferer. So I come to this work not just as a professional, of someone who tends to this kind of pain and anguish and development, but also as someone who battles with their own mental health. I have struggled with depression and anxiety for most of my life, but like a lot of people, I'm 40 years old, so I grew up in the 80s, and certainly looking back on my life, there were symptoms and expressions of anxiety and even depression as a child that went undiagnosed. Now, my parents were wonderful and they were loving and they did the best that they could, and they tended to me and were present. But seeing some of the things that I would say as a kiddo, I probably should have been taken to a therapist, but I wasn't. And so for me, I lived my life all the way really until my early 30s, sort of believing that these waves of despair that I would have and this kind of deep-rooted anxiety was essentially my cross to bear. I can literally remember telling people, I think this is just how God made me, and there's nothing really I can do about that. And it's my job to continue on into whatever God is calling me with this struggle. And there would be times where I would get to the point and I would think, I'm not sure I can do this on my own. Maybe I do need a professional, but I was very much influenced by stigma and did not seek help. It wasn't until I reached my early 30s and I was in the midst of ministry that I began to have panic attacks. And if you've never had a panic attack, effectively, the way that I best describe them is like they're like hurricanes in the brain. For me, it would be physical symptoms would come on. I'd get lightheaded. I'd have shooting pain go down my arm. I would have shortness of breath, and my brain would repeat on loop, "You're going to die. You're going to die." And so when those started happening, I was finally like, okay, I don't know what this is exactly, but I know this isn't something that I'm able to resolve on my own. And so that was when I first reached out and began to see a therapist. And in combination with the therapist and the psychiatrist and medication, I began my own path towards healing. And so all of the work that I do is really rooted in that beginning place of I've come up against this myself and know how difficult it is, and have benefited tremendously from the resources that are available in this country. And so I want to tell that story, and I'm willing to tell that story as much as humanly possible to encourage other people to get help. And that wasn't sort of like the end of my journey. As I talk about in the book, years went by kind of into my 30s, and I allowed myself to get unhealthy again in the midst of family and work and more school and all of that. And I got to a place where I was depressed and burned out, and I wasn't going to therapy. I wasn't in the support groups. I wasn't taking care of myself. And as I tell in the book, I got to a point, I was working as an Episcopal priest, and I showed up for services intoxicated and tried to lead, worship services. And that led to another point of like, okay, hold on, everything's got to stop. Everything has to stop, because if I'm not well internally, I'm not good for anybody else. And so that was another huge pivot point for me, where I eventually went for treatment and came back and stepped away from the church and have carried on. So that was now, I guess we're going on the better part of 4 years. But it was another wake-up call that, for me, my mental health struggles, right? The depression, anxiety, being prone to use substances, that's going to be ever present in my life. This isn't something that you just sort of fix and then move on from. It's going to require, constant work. And so briefly, yeah, that's me. I not only want to help with these things, but I very much raise my hand and say, yeah, me too. I struggle.
And I think that's a super helpful way of approaching this. And I think in reading the book, not only do you write really well, but it writes in a way or reads in a way that is just so open and inviting to be able to say, yep, that's me as well, because you kind of take that first step. And so I think people will really enjoy that. And I think that's really helpful.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, I'm a big believer that those of us who struggle in this way, if we are able to get on the path of healing, not that you ever get healed, but if you can get to a place where your wounds have been tended to a certain degree, sharing our stories, choosing to be vulnerable, right? And to open up and to say, yes, right? This has happened to me, or this is someone in my family. What we do there is we break down walls, and maybe we give someone else the permission to seek out the help that they're afraid to get. And that's what I think about every time. Sometimes I'm like, why am I doing this? Why do I drag myself back through this? It'd just be easier not to talk about it. I don't need to talk about my own story. And I remind myself, I was once that person who was desperate for help, but felt too afraid to say anything. There was too much stigma, too much pride, all of it, right? Too much sort of conflating the spiritual and the psychological and the emotional. And I think maybe if you talk about it here, you don't know who's going to hear your story, and that just might be the impetus they need, right, to make that phone call or to tell their friend or to tell their spouse. And who knows what could happen from there.
Yeah, I think that is so true. And I think, it leads into a question I was going to ask here of this idea that survey after survey comes out that this is a huge issue that is only on the rise. And I think there's this, on the one hand, we can accept that as a statistic that, oh yeah, like this percentage of people, but if we don't put names and faces on that, it becomes easy to kind of remain with the sense of stigma and shame that seems pervasive in many parts of the culture, but seems especially acute in the church. And so I think you've already hit on it there a little bit, but why do you think these stigmas and shame around mental health continue to persist, especially in the church?
In the church, yeah. Well, there's a lot of factors, right? There's a lot of answers, but I could isolate a few. And as someone like yourself who really appreciates church history, we can appreciate there are things that the church has done really well, right, over the centuries of its existence. And there are other things the church has not done well. And we have not been good at dealing and treating and welcoming struggles of mental health. And I think a large part of that is due to we take a lot of scripture out of context, and we have for a long time. So we're a religion, right, that believes, right, God has said things like, right, I will give you the peace which passeth all understanding, right? This idea that we worship the good shepherd who's going to lead us beside still waters, right? Make a banquet table for us in the presence of our enemies. And there is this notion that to be a good Christian, right, to be an authentic Christian, if you're in relationship with God, what that's going to do is provide you a sense of inner peace. And if you can't access that, what's often been taught is that the problem is with you and your faith, right? So you're not believing enough. So many people, I can't tell you how many Christians I've spoken to where they've had struggles with anxiety or depression, and they've gone to their religious leaders, and the advice and counsel that they've been given is, man, you got to get in your Bible more, you got to pray harder, you better get yourself to church, you better serve more. Maybe is there unconfessed sin, sort of like the friends of Job when he was going through his struggles, right? His friends say, clearly, Job, you're hiding something here. God is angry with you. Like, just get honest, man. Tell us what's really going on, and then we can rectify. The problem there, and I'm not saying that there aren't issues or times and instances in which sin can exacerbate, right, certain issues. But sin is not the cause of any kind of mental health suffering, mental health conditions, mental illness. Mental illness is just like all forms of physical suffering, right? We don't know and we can't fully explain why certain people have to deal with certain types of suffering and other people don't, right? That's not something we can answer, right, to a degree. But our suffering is real, and we cannot conflate a person's spiritual life and mental illness. Are they interconnected? Of course, everything, right, about a human being is interconnected. But we have to be able to turn down the volume a bit and create space for people to be able to say, yeah, I'm struggling in my mind, and for that not to immediately be met with some kind of theological judgment about what's going on with the person. So there's this real fear, I think, to raise up, because people might see themselves as not having the proper kind of faith. So there's that issue. We can unpack that for ages. Another issue is that the general stigma that exists in our culture, well, then, of course, is very much present in our churches. And it's this. A lot of people view mental health as like a static condition. So if you were to raise your hand and say, yeah, I battle with depression, or I think maybe that I drink too much, or whatever it might be, people are going to label you and put you in a box and say, oh, that guy's an alcoholic, or that girl is a depressive, or she's not in her right mind, or whatever it might be. And people do not want to be categorized as such. So it's static. And again, I could pivot, and hopefully we'll get to this and talk about this. That's just a completely inaccurate understanding of what's going on with mental health and mental illness. It's all spectrum. It's all moving all the time. But if I were just to isolate those two, it's that in the church, we conflate faith, we conflate spirituality and psychology. And then also just there's this general stigma that nobody wants to be put in the box, right? And nobody wants to be kind of stamped in that way, because it feels so different than other types of physical injury or disease.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and I'd like to dive into both of those ideas, and I think maybe in parallel tracks here. We'll start with the latter one of mental health being a static category that becomes a label for you. So it's not that you struggle with depression, but you are someone who is depressive, or you're depressed, or it's not that you're someone that struggles with drinking too much, but you're an alcoholic, or you're a drug addict, or et cetera, et cetera. And these kind of labels that stick and feel like a weight that people don't want to carry. So then you don't raise your hand to say you're in that category, which I think is fair, right? I don't want to be labeled that way. And so I think what we want to do is then come up with ways of talking about these things in more helpful ways. And so I think maybe a place to start is you talk about in your book that mental health comes in all shapes and sizes, and mental health struggles, they are not one size fits all. We use this umbrella category perhaps to be helpful in one way, because we can't list off the entire list of, diagnostic medicines, all the different thing, right? But I think there is a danger sometimes when we speak in too broad of generalities, or we don't have enough nuance when we're talking about these things. And it seems like that's something you're hitting on a bit there. So why is it important that we keep in mind the various shapes and sizes? And also, how can we maybe shift our language or shift our thinking around this move from someone who struggles with depression to instantly labeling that person depressive or et cetera like that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. Let me take the second part first. It's not static, right? Here's the way that I like to talk about this. Every human being has mental health, right? Nobody gets to opt out of this. It's in the same way that nobody gets to opt out of like being spiritual. We are spiritual creatures. That is who we are. You can choose to neglect your spirituality. You can choose to deny its existence, right? You can choose to sort of nominally look at it, or you can choose to really tend to it and care for it. And that's gonna affect your life. Everybody has mental health, right? This is how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, right, affect our life. That's mental health. We're on a spectrum. So if you can picture mental health as like, let's say it's far over on the right side of the spectrum, and mental illness is far over on the left side. All human beings are somewhere on this spectrum at all times in their life, and they are not at a fixed point. In the same way that none of us can ever say, hey, in this moment, I am fully physically healthy. I am perfect. No, 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 no. When you say I'm healthy, what you're describing is that, you know what? I'm closer to health than I am illness in this moment. I'm healthy, right? I don't have a chronic condition. I don't have a fever. I'm taking care of myself, whatever that might be. And there are other times in our life where you're sick, right? Or maybe you have a real illness, you're battling with cancer or whatever it might be, and you're further on the left side of that spectrum. Same thing with mental health. We can move along this spectrum, and it depends upon a variety of factors at different points in our lives. Biology, our circumstances, the way that we think, our neurochemistry, all of this can be manipulated and tended to, right? And will affect where we're at on the spectrum. Now, hear me clearly. I am not in any way being adversarial at this point to psychiatry. I am a huge proponent of psychiatry. I work with psychiatrists all the time. I take an antidepressant myself every day when I wake up. There are certain mental illnesses that some people have and other people don't have, and they will never experience those particular symptoms. If a person has schizophrenia, right, they potentially might deal with hearing voices in their head or having thoughts of delusion that a person that struggles with major depressive disorder just simply is not going to have. These conditions are different. And so what I'm not saying is that a person once they got their diagnosis of schizophrenia, maybe that's going to go away or whatever that might be. That condition is going to be there. It's real, just like a diagnosis of diabetes, right? But what all of us have the ability to do is to tend to whatever mental health condition we have and to take care of it as best we can in the same way that we would any other kind of physical diagnosis. So it's always moving. And we'll probably talk about this later, but I kind of take a three-legged stool approach with that, depending upon, getting professional services, right? Some kind of treatment, medication, and support network are sort of the three things we can look at to kind of tend to what's happening there. Will you repeat the first part of your question because it's jumped out of my mind?
Yeah, and that relates to the idea that I think you've kind of hit it. So I talked about
Okay.
Comes in all shapes and sizes, and then we move from this idea of you struggle with this to you are that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Let me say one more thing about that. You're right, because I love that language where you're like, man, we speak in these umbrella terms and we need to be more detailed. And here's why. The next step in sort of like battling this stigma is not just to be able to talk about these things, but to be able to hold space for people when they express these conditions. So it's where unfortunately we're getting to a better place, right? Where Christians are like, hey, this is real. It's out there, right? If it's true that we can bring all of our suffering, right, to Christ, then it must be true, right, that we can bring all of our kind of mental suffering. The thing is, though, we say that, but then the moment somebody shows up, right, and is actually struggling in this way, oftentimes it's just way too uncomfortable for people. So one of the goals I have, where I'm trying to push people, is like, we've got to make it not just okay in our Christian communities, right, to talk about these things, but to be able to welcome and hold space for the plethora of ways, often uncomfortable ways, in which these illnesses express themselves, and hold space for that, and then not rush into this labeling like you're talking about, right? I mean, how often do you hear people say, oh, she's bipolar, or he's schizophrenic? No. That is so reductionistic. Especially as Christians, we should be the last people, right, to be tying anyone's identity to any kind of condition that they're dealing with. No, he has schizophrenia, right? In the same way that someone has cancer. She's not bipolar. She has bipolar. We cannot conflate disorder with identity. It's an aspect of someone's identity. And because it's an aspect of someone's identity, right, we can make no sort of categorical judgments, right, about who the person is. I just think that's and the antithesis of what the spirit of the gospel is. And yet it's something that's done so often, and it's deeply, deeply painful.
It really is. And I hope that, as we continue to see things move forward, that the church doesn't only catch up to the culture, but could, because I think it has the resources in the gospel to lead the way forward of seeing people in a more holistic light. That might be a bit rose-colored glasses there, and I recognize that, but I think that's what we should be striving for as the church. And I would like to pivot a bit to that question of what is the church's role in this? And I think you write well on it. I want to read a quote from your book here. You write, while it's not the church's job to cure mental illness, the church should be a major player in any conversation for caring about those who suffer in their minds. But we haven't been. In fact, in many cases, Christians have been some of the worst offenders when it comes to attaching stigma to mental illness, often attributing it to a spiritual failing, unconfessed sin, flimsy faith, or plain old lack of religious devotion. And so I think you make a helpful distinction here of the church probably doesn't have the resource. Well, maybe it does, but probably isn't currently well equipped to, cure mental illness, right? And cure probably isn't. I think it's probably an intentional word you're using there when you talk about what the church can and can't do. But it does have a part to play. And so could you flesh that out a bit when you think about the church as, someone who has been in the church as a priest and all of these things? What do you see in your daydream of what the church can and should be when it comes to mental health?
I love this question. And if you work at a church and you're listening to this, or you're really involved, please listen carefully. We have to dial down the pressure that people feel around these issues. So often people will not inquire about a person's, mental health if they think they're struggling, because they're so afraid that they're going to say yes to the question of are you depressed? Are you thinking of harming yourself? Whatever it might be. And they don't not ask the question because they don't care. They're terrified that the person's going to say yes, and they don't know what to do, right? So it's fear that drives our unwillingness. Here's the thing. Like you just read from the book, not the church's job to cure this. They don't have the resources. Churches are not equipped, right, to handle this kind of work. That's not their job. Here's what we need to know. When a person is struggling with their mental health, the two people they're most likely to speak to first are their primary physician, right? They'll tell, and their pastor. Right? The church has an opportunity to catch people, because people often trust the church. Hopefully the church earns and is operating in such a way that it can handle that trust. When people come forward, what we have to do, right, is listen without judgment and understand that when a person is expressing these kinds of struggles, the church's job is to receive them and point them in the direction of the professionals they need, right? So to be able to say, so don't spiritualize it, don't try to wash it away, right? You can absolutely offer, right? We offer prayer, we offer worship, we offer community, we offer all the resources that the church has, but we say, look, there are trained professionals out there whose job it is to tend to this kind of suffering. I think you ought to go see one. And so I am a big believer in churches need to have resources already identified in their individual communities that they can give to people to say, here's a list of trusted providers in the area. Our job, we don't have to cure it. We just catch people because they come, and then help them get where they need to go, and to affirm them when they express these worries that God's going to judge them for this, or that the community is, or they don't have enough faith. All of that we affirm. No. God if our God is the God, right, that hangs on the cross. What that means is that our God isn't necessarily promising to explain all of our suffering. It's not necessarily promising to take away all of our suffering. But what Jesus on a cross says is there's no suffering that I won't enter into and be with you in, right? That's the word that the church can offer, while at the same time saying, God's with you. You need to talk to the doctor, though, right? Just like if you had a, congestive heart failure, right? No pastors are saying, let's pray, or no one in there, no people, that are operating ethically would say, and don't go see the cardiologist, right? It's not an either or situation, right? It's an and all of the things. God has provided so many resources to help us experience the abundant life. It's our job to make sure, right, as a church, that people are getting access to the resources that they need.
I love that answer. And the thing is, again, for those people who work in churches that are listening to this, I would be very surprised if those resources don't exist in your broader community. Like, they're out there.
Right.
We just need to identify them and be able to, I don't want to say this too harshly. Let me think of how I want to say this, but have kind of be comfortable enough in our own shoes, whether that's as a pastor or the person that's coming to you, to be able to say, like, I'm not the one that's going to fix this, because we have that tendency in churches and as humans. If someone came to me, they trust me, I'm going to be the one that fixed this. This makes me feel good, but recognize, actually, this isn't my lane. My lane is to listen to you, to comfort you, and to point you to the specialists in this. And I think when the church can do that, they can make a huge impact, as you said, as one of the two first people that people are going to talk to. So I think that's really helpful there.
Thank you. Huge impact. Don't underestimate, especially if you're working at a church and you're listening to this, do not underestimate how powerful that can be. So many people spend their entire lives not hearing this in their church communities. You can be the person that disrupts that generational pattern and can very well be the one who liberates someone and says, oh, it's okay to seek out this kind of help. And it is no reflection upon your relationship with God or your devotion. None of that. It just is what it is. We live in a world with deep, deep and constant suffering. And it takes many shapes and forms. And one of the more difficult forms that it takes is mental illness.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to, I don't know if it's a pivot or maybe drill down into one more specific topic here. And it's a very serious one, not that all of what we've been talking about is very serious, but we're going to talk about suicide here. And I just want to always, whenever I bring this up on the channel, to let people know, if this is something you are currently struggling with, suicidal thoughts or ideation, I'll put a number that you can text or a link that you can go to for a suicide hotline, and please get the help that you need. And as we've been saying, there is nothing wrong with getting that help. Actually, I think it's a quite brave thing to do, but I always want to make sure to put that in there before we talk about this topic. And so with that in mind, I think for many people, suicide is either so hard to imagine that they refrain from thinking about it, or so troubling that they're scared to let their mind go there. And I think that's understandable. This is a grave and serious thing, and I think maybe on some level should make us uncomfortable, but not so much that we don't talk about it. And so we've touched on this a bit, but specifically with suicide, why is it so important that we talk about it? I remember in your book, I think you were mentioning these theology live talks you guys had in a pub, which I would love to talk about that on another day. Yeah. And you saying you wanted to bring this up, and people were like, well, won't that be too depressing? But that wasn't quite the reaction that you all had when you went forward with it. So why do we need to be talking about this?
Because people are desperate to talk about suicide and are quite literally like dying, right? Not to put too fine of a point on it, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. The 10th. It is the second leading cause of death for Americans aged 14 to 24 in this country. Only catastrophic accidents, right, lead it, and it's surging at the moment. Also, when you really dig into the research, even folks who have never experienced any kind of suicidal ideation, battled their mental health, people self-report that they think about killing themselves at far greater rates than we have previously imagined, right? That it'll cross the mind. So we've got an epidemic. We have a real serious issue with suicide. And suicide, unlike a lot of other deaths that if you look at those kind of like top reasons why we die every year, so many of these deaths are preventable. Not all of them are preventable. And I want to say this, and this is something that people don't often like to hear. But the reality is that when we think about suicide, suicide is often just the culmination, right, of a death from mental illness, right? It is the disease itself for some people running its course. And just like other illnesses, sometimes you throw everything you can at the illness and the illness still does its thing and people die. And that is just a reality that I pray to God that maybe at some point we get to, and that's not the case, but it currently that is the case. And so what I don't want to do is wax Pollyanna about this and say, hey, if we talk about this, if we get there'll be no more suicides. That's far too simplistic. It would be a wonderful thing to imagine and hope for, but it's a reality. So it's there. So we have to talk about it. Suicide is a death that is different from other deaths in many, many ways. And here's one of the big important ways. If you're coming at this and you have difficulty talking about it or difficulty imagining it, because we have this instinct, right, to want to live, right? When a brain and a body and a soul is functioning well, like this is baked into our DNA, right, into our soul, this desire to live. And so it feels unfathomable that people would choose, right, not to live. Here's the thing. Most of the time, when people die by suicide, we know through the research of people who have attempted suicide and survived that most of the time, suicide is not about ending life. It is about ending pain. People get to a place in their life where the pain is so overwhelming that they become convinced there is no other way for this pain to end than some kind of oblivion. So it enters their mind early on as like, well, maybe that's an option, right? This is how people will often talk about it in therapy. It's like, look, if this continues, maybe down the line, right? If nothing works, there's always that option just to sort of like turn out the lights, right? And then if the suffering goes on long enough, that option that's out there starts to become a little bit better, right? It becomes a little more attractive. That's sort of when you know the person is progressing down the illness. And then it goes from an option to a good option. And if it goes long enough, then it becomes the only option, right? And that's when it will be taken. Here's the other thing, though, that we know from people who survive suicide attempts. Oftentimes, until the very last moment, even when it becomes sort of like the only option, they still remain ambiguous about it. There's still kind of a back and forth battle that's going on in their mind. And so I think, okay, that to me is actually hopeful, because that to me thinks no one's beyond the pale here for the most part, given the disclaimer that I gave, right? That, right? You don't know. But that to me says, okay, if people are ambiguous about that, then imagine if we had this opportunity with anything else that's on sort of like the top 10 leading causes of death, but we can talk to people about this. We can offer solutions. We can help them get to where they need to go. We can dramatically, I think, reduce the number of suicides in this country by elevating this topic. And we start there just by normalizing the topic. And I so appreciate your sensitivity with the trigger warning. All that's what we need, right? It's to say, look, not only are we going to talk about this, but we're going to talk about this in a really compassionate way. And we're not going to assume that we're just talking to people who aren't struggling, right? Who need to know how to talk about this, to talk to other people. But like, there will be people who are listening to this who have either been in this place, right? Or are thinking about it, or they've lost a loved one to suicide. And that's a whole different topic. I work with folks who lose a family member, right, to suicide, and the grieving of a suicide is is far more complicated than the grieving of other deaths. Not say it's somehow worse, but it introduces particular questions and struggles for the survivors of the suicide that other deaths do not. Again, I could go on about this for a long time, but it's so critical that we talk about it and do so in a compassionate way, because lots of people are dying. Let me say this: if two things, if someone right, expresses to you that they are considering hurting themselves or killing themselves, just like I gave the advice to the pastors and those who work in the church, like, you don't have to solve it. Here's what you have to do: get real quiet, listen to what they're saying. Do not judge it. Do not tell them what your Aunt Sally did, right? Just listen to it. Reflect back their pain. Say, it sounds like you're in a tremendous amount of pain. Maybe say something like, if I were in that situation, I think I would be in a tremendous amount of pain as well. And then say, there are professionals, right, who are trained to deal with this. I wonder if you should reach out to them, right? Or there are suicide hotlines, right? You can immediately pick up the phone and talk to someone. Maybe you ought to do that, right? That's all you have to do. So many times when people are at that place where suicide has become the only option, they feel as though nobody cares. Right? The pain is so great, they feel so isolated. Again, just you being able to sit with them and acknowledge that the pain is real, and then just to make sure that you say there are people who can help, right? You could save a life. You could absolutely save a life. And the other thing I would say to the person who is struggling is that the only thing we know for sure in life is that it's forever changing, moment to moment. And our emotions and our thoughts are like the weather, right? We don't control them. They come and they go and they change. And if you're suffering tremendously in this moment, if you can hear me say, we don't know what the next moment is going to bring. That's one of the lies that particularly depression loves to tell, is that the pain that you're in is going to be the exact same pain you're going to be in tomorrow. And actually, it's probably going to be worse and it's never going to end. It's a lie. Right? That's a false narrative that depression feeds us to keep us sick. What I want to say is, no. If you can hold on, tomorrow can be really different than today. And I know it doesn't feel that way, but you got to believe it. Take it from someone who's been there. If you can stick around and you can keep fighting, right, you can feel different than you feel today. Tomorrow can be really, really different.
Thank you for that. I think that is all so important, and I hope that everyone is listening carefully there, no matter where they're at in their mental health journey or on that spectrum that we talked about. And wherever you are today, as you said, it might be somewhere different tomorrow. And I think whether that's hope for you that tomorrow can be easier, or whether you're someone that watches my videos and you happen to click on this one and this isn't something that you'd usually listen to, I think there will be people that you love that will struggle with this, and you may find yourself struggling with this at one point as well. And so I hope that you're able to latch onto these things. I want to ask, as we did with the others, about the church's role, because I know many people who watch this channel, they love the church, they're interested in the church, and we talked about the church's role as kind of that place that can people come to, and then we can give them resources and point them in the right direction and listen to them and hear them. I want to talk a little bit like pastorally and theologically here, and I hope that we can do that in a way that, and I know we can, recognizes that these aren't just abstract theological concepts, right? Like this is real life, and these are hurting people. These aren't ideas in a book or something like that. But you talk in your book about how the Catholic Church's position has changed on suicide throughout the years. And then you bring up G.K. Chesterton as kind of a negative example of a really unhelpful way of thinking theologically or pastorally about suicide. Right. So how can essentially the church do better in thinking about these things?
Yeah. Well, I love the the point you're making here. Theology matters. Right? What we believe really, really matters, and it influences behavior. So, it used to be that the Roman Catholic Church would not bury a person who died by suicide on church grounds, right? The idea was that this was hallowed, this was consecrated, and kind of G.K. Chesterton's sort of, thinking was like, this is sort of like the ultimate act of rebellion against God, right? To extinguish one's own life, right? It's this sort of like the opposite of gratitude for life, right? To snuff out, one's life. And so there's a sin against God and oneself in that place. Again, disclaimer, could it be the case that in some instances, right, someone taking their own life, there's sin involved in that? Maybe that's not my job. That's not my job to make that determination. God is the one, right, who decides or who makes any kind of judgment, not us, right? Suicide is not a rejection, right, of God always. I guess it could be, maybe in certain forms. I don't know, but it is the end result of illness, right? Most of the time. So if you traditions, again, like the Catholic Church, have been able to move to say, look, we thought about this in one particular way for a period of time, but then we gathered and received new information, right? Science is helping us understand. Sociology is helping us understand. Theories of relationships and system thinking helps us understand. Trauma helps us understand that human beings find themselves in really complex situations and profound suffering. And just this theological premise of you can't take life, and if you do and you take your own, you're kind of like out, isn't a good enough answer. And so the church had to evolve. And so we must continue to evolve on this particular issue and in this particular way to be able to receive and to acknowledge, right, that this isn't necessarily just a rejection, right, of God. I think I tell this story in the book where I talk about years ago presiding and preaching at the service of a man who did die by suicide. And notice my language there. I'm very intentional about the language. I never say commit suicide. And you'll see this and you'll hear this in the media a lot. The word commit has legal connotations. Like you hear the word commit and you think, oh, I committed robbery, right? I committed murder. I committed adultery. Like this, there's this sort of nefarious tone to it. We die by suicide is a way to afford more dignity and accuracy to what happens there. To say someone commits suicide is to imply that it's 100% volitional. It's not always 100% volitional. We have to take into consideration these other factors. So anyway, I performed this funeral, and at the funeral, it was the death of a man whose father was a very, very prominent Dallas figure. And so it was a massive funeral, all kinds of people there. And the family made it very clear to me. They said, we want you to name this. We want you to name it because we want to not only worship God, honor the life of our son, but take this opportunity right in the here and the now to be honest in the church, right? About what has happened here so other people can know. And so it was this beautiful moment where we took the ultimate pain to lose a child, even though it's a woman, to suicide. I mean, what can you imagine anything more painful than that? And to acknowledge that this happens, and to say though that even here, in this place of despair, right, we can still say things that are true, that the suffering is real and that it's complex, but that the God of all life and resurrection, right, is still true, and there's still hope, and there's love, and there's space for all of this, right? And that's theology, right? That's if you've got a theology that's too brittle or very, very small, and you need to understand everything, you need to control everything, and only these kinds of things happen to people who rebel against God, you can't do that kind of thing. But if you believe God is big enough, right, to take on anything in this world, right, anything, then you can describe and you can name anything. You can talk about all the facets of reality, and you can do so resting, right, in the absolute kind of sovereignty of the infinite love of God. And to me, speaking to that is just another way, right, of saying, yeah, God is bigger than all of this and is in all of this and is not going away. And so there's hope.
I love that. And I think that really is theology at its best there, being able to have that big picture. And like you talked about, not being so brittle there, really appreciate that. And in the few minutes that we have left, I want to end the main section by talking about treatment, and then we'll go through a couple rapid fire questions at the end. So you offer kind of this three-legged stool, I guess. I don't know if that's the metaphor you use or not, but there's 3 parts to it that you offer in the book. Specifically, those are people, therapy, and medication. I don't think in that order, but we'll go with it.
It's great. Yeah.
And so talk about that a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, so by research, we know that if someone's struggling with mental health condition, by the way, 1 in 4 Americans every year struggle with mental health in a way that rises to a level of clinical significance, right? So lots of us, and that's self-report. So if we're saying 1 in 4, it's probably like 2 out of 4, right? We know that over time, the thing that produces the best results is talk therapy. So sitting down with a human being who's trained to talk with you and processing in all the different kinds of ways that can happen, we get the best results, right? For a lot of people, it's medication and a combination of medication and therapy. So what psychotropic medications do, oftentimes, especially in the church, people have a misunderstanding about this. There's no medicine that cures mental illness, right? What primarily, let's just talk about antidepressants, that are the most popular. What antidepressants do is they reduce symptoms. So it's kind of like if you think about what like an anti-inflammatory does, like Advil, right? It doesn't repair anything, but what it does is it shrinks inflammation and allows the body to do its thing and to heal more efficiently. Same thing with antidepressants. Oftentimes, if a person is really, really struggling with the anxiety or their mood is so low they can't get out of bed, what the antidepressants do is they provide more margin to work. So if we can just reduce some of the symptoms, then we can engage with therapy, or we can engage with work, or we can engage with our spiritual life or in our relationships in ways that otherwise can't be accessed without the medication. So for a lot of people that are really struggling, right, it's the combination of these two things. There are some people for whom taking the medication reduces the symptoms enough and they don't need talk therapy. But I always recommend, if you're gonna take anything, if you're going to get on, if your general practitioner puts you on some antidepressants, I really encourage people to pair that, at least for a time, with a mental health professional to process what's going on there. Because just to kind of take the approach that, just take the medicine, that's sort of all you need, again, is too reductionistic. That's to say, mental health is just about this sort of biological component. No, that's a part of it, but it's only one part of it. It's a big part of it. It's important. So talk therapy, avail yourselves, right, to someone who's trained. If you need medication, at least be open to it, the medication. And then the third piece is the social support. Human beings are not made to live in isolation. Again, it's a deeply, deeply Christian principle. I mean, what's the one thing in Genesis, right at the very beginning, that God says is not good? Right, that the earthling is alone, right? He needs another earthling. Needs another human being. I'll never forget, early on in my training, I was talking to a psychiatrist. I was shadowing him. He's an addictionologist, works with people that are deep kind of life or death situations, oftentimes with addiction. And he said, if I can just get my patients plugged into a meaningful community, a place where they can be, where people know who they are and they know some other people, he's like, half the battle is done. I'm like, hold on, wait a second. You're like one of those highly trained like psychiatrists out there. You're telling me that like, if you can just like get your patients to have a friend, then half of your job is done. He's like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. And he is right. When you are struggling, I mean, even when you're in good health, but particularly if you're struggling, mental health can feel so isolating when you're struggling with illness. If you can connect with other human beings and have that social support network, I cannot overemphasize the dramatic effect that can have on people. We are not made to be alone, not made to suffer alone. We often begin to understand ourselves and know ourselves for who we really are, which is beloved children of God in the presence of other people. So I could go on, but mental health professionals, medication, if appropriate, but everybody needs social support. And I tell people, and I deal with a lot of lonely people who say, well, I don't know what to do about that. I don't have friends. I don't have family, all this. And here's what I say. I get that it's hard, but we will keep working and stop at nothing until you find a community, because if you don't, we got problems here. And I don't care how long it takes. We have to be dogged about this. And I help people and have to get creative, and we do all kinds of things. But you cannot settle for not having some meaningful relationships in your life, particularly if you struggle with your mental health. The prognosis there isn't good.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And thanks for all of your time today. I think we're actually going to skip the final four here. I know you've got someone coming in just 2 minutes, but
Thanks.
Thank you so much for your time. I'll be sure to link to your book and to your website. But if people want to find you, Ryan Casey Walker, thanks again for your time. Well, there you have it, folks. That video ended a bit abruptly, but I hope that you enjoy it. And thanks again to Ryan for coming on the channel. As always, links are in the description, including resources that I think you will find helpful. Thank you all for your courage in listening to this conversation that could have been uncomfortable, could have been challenging at times. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope it leads you to your next step in that healing journey, wherever you are on that spectrum of mental health. I think is a great opportunity to be able to shed the light on something that is oh so important. Love you guys, and I will see you next time.